Welcome, and thank you for joining City Parks Alliance and World Urban Parks for this special joint webinar. Today, we'll explore how park leaders are using data about park use to better understand their park systems and make smarter decisions about how to deploy limited resources. My name is Diana Colangelo. I'm a Senior Program Manager at City Parks Alliance, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. If you're interested in continuing education credits for this webinar for AICP or World Parks Academy, watch for a follow-up email in the next 2 business days with instructions on how to claim your credits. So we all know that parks around the world have seen record high use during the pandemic as people sought safe places to exercise, to connect with others and nature, and to just get some fresh air and a break from being indoors. Although we know anecdotally that park use has risen virtually everywhere, park organizations may lack a data-driven picture of how park use is changing and how this information might impact their management of park assets and resources. Given the fact that budget cuts and decreased revenues are a reality being faced by many park organizations in the wake of the pandemic, it's increasingly important to use these data-driven methods and tools to understand trends related to park use and what the community wants and needs from its park system. So today we'll hear from 2 park leaders who are implementing and refining various methods for collecting park use data using both human-based methods and technology-based methods to capture a range of information. So with us today are Martin van Jaarsveld, Manager of Community Parks and Places within Parks, Sport and Recreation at Auckland Council in Auckland, New Zealand, and Jesús Aguirre, Superintendent at the City of Seattle Parks and Recreation Department in Seattle, Washington. So we'll hear both of our presentations before moving into Q&A. Here are some tips related to asking questions and troubleshooting technical difficulties. To ask a question, click the questions icon on your screen. Type the question into the box and click send. Feel free to send questions throughout the presentations, just know we will be holding them until the end. If you experience a technical problem during the webinar, please type it in the question box and send it to us, and we will do our best to help you. And if you miss something, don't worry. Links to the presentations, recording, and related resources will be emailed to all registrants. So without further ado, now let's hear from Martin about the various ways his team at Auckland Council is measuring park use and taking the pulse on what the community needs. Martin, take it away.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about how we use visitor analytics in Auckland to make sure that we deliver the right outcomes in our parks. But first, a bit about Auckland and the council. Auckland has a diverse population of around 1.7 million people, and we have one local authority for the city called Auckland Council. The council has a 2-tier governance structure. The governing body looks after the big picture, and they set the budgets and citywide policies and strategies. Then we have 21 local boards, and they focus on local issues, including local parks. We have over 4,000 parks in Auckland with an extensive coastline, and access to the coast is a key factor of quality of life for Aucklanders. In the parks unit, we have about 200 staff, and around 15 staff are involved in customer surveys and visitor analytics. For example, in my team, I have 8 park specialists, and part of their role is to define outcomes in our parks, and they rely heavily on customer data to make sure that we deliver the right outcomes in our parks. We also have operational budgets that we can use to engage contractors to undertake some of the survey work for us. Now, I can break the visitor analytics into citywide and local board based and park specific analysis. Typically, the citywide surveys are done on an ongoing basis, while the park specific surveys are done as a once-off, and that is to be used to identify specific outcomes in parks. Now, the citywide analysis gives us a very important holistic overview of how Aucklanders use our parks. For example, we have a customer experience survey that we started in 2019, and that tells us where, how, and why Aucklanders are visiting parks. That survey is done on a 6-monthly basis, and we have a sample size of at least 2,000 people. And we are getting some really good customer insights from the survey. For example, we can get an indication of how often Aucklanders use our parks, and we can drill down into the different age groups and the different ethnic communities. For example, the over 70s visit our parks the most frequently. We can get information on what type of parks people visit most often, and from that graph you can see our local parks are the most popular. We can get information on the type of activities that people undertake in parks, and walking is by far the most popular activity in parks, followed by visiting a playground. And in that graph you can see that the walking activity has increased significantly after COVID. So people are obviously keen to get out in our parks and enjoy the environment. If we look at some interesting statistics based on age group, the younger Aucklanders are more likely than other groups to go to a park to relax or to play sport. The age between 30 and 39 are more likely to make use of our playgrounds. They obviously take their kids to the playgrounds, and then those aged between 60 and 69 use parks for walking. Another type of survey that we do on a local board basis is what we call diversity studies, especially in those local board areas where we have a lot of new migrants and diverse makeup of our population. And those studies give us a good understanding how different ethnic communities use our parks. And we typically use interviews, online surveys, and focus groups to get that information. Now, park-specific analysis and surveys, and this is quite an important aspect of the work that we do. Every year we undertake between 15 and 20 park-specific visitor analytics. So how do we identify which parks to do a specific analysis on? There are two ways. Firstly, through planning. And typically we would do a gap analysis. We will assess where the growth areas are, and then we rely on the holistic customer data to identify the priority areas that we need to target. Secondly, it could be that we have to respond to an issue in a park. For example, we might have a lot of coastal erosion in a park and we have to take action. And addressing that issue will prioritize the work on that park. I'm now going to go through a number of different methodologies that we use. Firstly, heat maps. We have started to use this about 2 years ago, and heat maps tells us about the number of movements in a park. We can get information around the type of movements, for example, pedestrian or cycling. Importantly, it identifies the locations and the areas in the park that are used by people, and we can also detect the directions of the movements. So the heat maps are produced from video recordings from cameras that are placed at various locations in the park. And one of the key benefits of this methodology is that it gives us a highly accurate data on the type of movements. In this particular case, the accuracy was important to us, and because we wanted to understand which parts of the park people use, but also what the usage levels were between the park and the beach adjacent to the park. At the time, we investigated using Wi-Fi and smartphone data, but it could not give us the same level of accuracy. Another methodology is what we call observation surveys, and we often use this to complement the heat map data. So we would get staff or contractors to visit the site for a set period of time, and then observe the type of activities that people undertake in the park. We also use observation surveys to identify potential barriers or obstacles in the way people use the park. So that is an important survey that gives us that qualitative data. Social Pinpoint, that is a web-based system whereby members of the public can go in and provide their feedback and then pin their comments on a specific location on the map. The example in front of you is a peninsula where we are doing a coastal management plan. So the pink pins are where people tell us about what they value about the parks, and the green pins are the activities that they like to undertake in the parks. So that gives us a good visual representation of the feedback from the public. An important aspect of this is that once we have all the information, we need to translate the feedback that we got into outcomes. And that is where the park specialists play a key role. Visitor survey and research on a park-specific basis. This is used when we need some really in-depth analysis of how people use the particular park. We cover issues like the frequency of visits, the reason for visiting, the type of activities people undertake, the length of stay, the mode of transport, and the satisfaction levels. We use a range of different methods, interviews, survey cards, and phone surveys. Time-lapse drone footage is an important part of the picture, and probably not on itself, but used in combination with other methodologies. And it's a snapshot in time to give us that visual indication of the usage patterns and the type of activities that people undertake in a park. We use comparison demand estimates in those cases where we don't have a new facility yet, but we would like to get an indication of the likely usage levels of that facility. For example, we might plan a new walkway, and as part of the benefit cost analysis, we want to get a better understanding of what the likely usage levels of that new facility will be. So we then look at 6 to 8 different types of existing walkways where we would capture data through track counters, and then we use that information to give us an estimate of the likely usage of that new facility. This is important, especially if we want to seek additional funding for a new asset. We use supply and demand analysis for our sports fields. Firstly, we start with understanding the capacity of our sports fields network. Then we work with our sports clubs to understand the membership numbers and what the anticipated growth for that sport is. And then we can determine the demand over time. And we can then use that data to guide our investment in sports fields. So on that map, you can see the red and orange areas are where we have a deficit or a shortfall in our sports field capacity. We use a lot of track counters. Probably the most useful type of counters is where we have automated data and where we can get live reports. So we use a web-based system whereby we can track the data, and we can run all sorts of reports where we compare different tracks. We could look at the daily peaks or the weekly peaks. Ideally, we would place a track counter in one location for at least a year, but if possible for a 2-year period. And then we can get a good understanding of the trends and the seasonal variations. Then lastly, we deliver a number of programs and events in parks focused around environmental education. And we also have a large number of volunteers working in our parks. So we use our volunteers to capture data on the number of volunteer hours that is spent in our parks, and also the type of activities that they undertake. So, for example, over the last 5 years, we have seen volunteer activities in our parks doubled, which is quite a good sign. But we also capture data in the other events that we deliver, for example, guided walks, or we might have a bush camp for young people. And it's important to capture as much information as possible so that we can understand how many people attend those events, and also whether we are delivering the right outcome. So we use that data to improve the programs that we deliver. So how do we use this data? Personally, I think the most important way is to ensure that we deliver the right outcome at the right location. The example on the slide is one of our coastal parks where we experienced a lot of coastal erosion. And about 5 years ago, we presented a number of options to the local board. And at that time, the option at the top was the preferred one. And that included a seawall where we would reduce the beach and extend the grassed area. Ever since that time, Council has taken more of an outcome-based approach. So after we have undertaken a number of surveys and visitor analytics, we realized that the seawall option is not the right outcome for that park. So we are now moving towards an outcome that is reflected in the concept plan at the bottom, which includes extending the beach and reinstating some of the sand dunes, and then pull back some of the park facilities and relocating the playgrounds. So not only has this customer data enabled us to ensure that we meet our community needs, we will also save significant costs by delivering the outcome at the bottom. We use the data to seek additional funding. So if we seek funding, we need to prepare business cases. So the more data we can include in our business cases, the better chance we have for funding. For example, we have recently received 35 million New Zealand dollars from the government for a walkway project, and we used comparable data analysis methodology to identify the benefit cost ratio. So that evidence-based approach is really important for us. We use the data to prioritize our investment, and especially since COVID, our budgets have been cut. So we need to make sure that we target our investment where the priorities are. So the customer data and visitor insights are very important to enable us to prioritize. Then it ensures that we optimize our parks network. In some cases, we need to look at rationalizing our facilities. For example, in some parks, we have too many tracks and we cannot maintain all the tracks. So we use the data from our track counters to identify the priority tracks and the high use tracks. And then lastly, in New Zealand, we have to get a resource consent to build new assets. And the data that we capture is often used as part of our resource consent application. In some cases, we get objections from the wider public against a specific facility. For example, the coastal walkway on the slide is one example where we had to go to the Environment Court to justify our investment. And in this case, we used track counter data and observation surveys as evidence to demonstrate that there is a need for a coastal walkway in that area. So thank you very much for the opportunity. Just to conclude, personally, I think getting good customer data and get a really good understanding of how people use our parks is now more important than ever. We cannot afford to deliver outcomes that are not meeting our community needs. So we have to get it right the first time. And by using this data, we can get a high level of surety that we will get it right. So thank you very much for the opportunity and happy to answer questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Martin. It's really interesting to hear about the wide range of methods that you're using. And I think several of the things that you talked about seem like they could be really replicable or not too difficult to try to pilot or implement in cities. So really interesting to hear about those different approaches. Next, let's hear about Seattle's efforts. So Jesús, you're all set to take it away. Oh, Jesús, you're muted.
My apologies. Is my screen up?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you all. Thank you, Diana. Thanks, Martin. That was really informative. And thanks to CPA and World Urban Parks. It's an honor to be here today to talk a little bit about the Seattle Parks and Recreation's work on continuing to become data informed. Our presentation today is about one specific aspect of this work that really grew out of the pandemic and a problem that we identified during the pandemic that we needed to find a solution for. It was really about how do we find the tools, create the program, and come up with a solution that served our public. So before I jump into that, just a little bit about Seattle. Seattle is in the Pacific Northwest area of Washington, D.C. We're a rapidly growing city. In 2020, we're the fastest growing city in the United States. We have a population of over 760,000, up from 608,000 just 10 years ago. And we are, we're the hub of lots of industry, Amazon, Starbucks, Boeing, Microsoft, and others. And so a lot happening in our city, a lot of the demographics, a lot of growth. All of this in a relatively small landmass. We have about 84 square miles. But one thing that's really critical and important for us is that Seattleites love our parks and our parks and recreation system. And we're really grateful that is the case. So in terms of parks and recreation, we are a municipal parks and recreation agency. We work with under the direction of a mayor, with the city council. We have our own board of park commissioners, and we're funded by the city's general fund. We're funded also by our own revenue that we collect through fees. And then we've also created recently an independent park district that creates a funding stream that allows us to enhance and support the other funding streams. Our parks and recreation system in Seattle is a fairly typical municipal parks and recreation system. Our goal is to support healthy people, a healthy environment, and build strong communities. We do that through what I think for our city is a pretty robust parks and recreation system. We have 6,400 acres of parkland developed and undeveloped, all of that dispersed over 485 parks. We have 26 community centers, 8 indoor pools, golf courses, and lots of other amenities such as skate parks, dog parks, athletic fields, playgrounds, trails, you name it. So it's a pretty robust system. And to complement the physical amenities, we also have many both physical and now virtual recreation programs for people of all ages. We do this through an organization that is about 900 full-time employees, but of course during our busy season in the summer, we almost double in size in terms of our seasonal and our temporary staff that comes on board. So, like everyone else, in 2020, we had to change very, very quickly in the way that we worked, and had to figure out both how to help our communities respond to the drastic changes, and had to quickly understand how our parks were being used and how we could keep our staff and our community safe while continuing to provide this incredibly vital service to our communities. And on the pictures, you see some of the activities that were all new to us in terms of learning quickly about infection rates, learning quickly about PPE and how to keep folks safe, learning quickly about messaging and how we communicated with our users so that we can keep everybody safe as we went through this process. And we learned a lot. A little more background in terms of the experience here in Seattle. we were in the United States, were the first area where COVID-19 was identified in Washington State, and then that was in January, and then at the end of February, sadly, we were the first area that reported a death here in the United States, and this was just in a suburb of Kirkland, Washington. Of Seattle, which is Kirkland, Washington. So we immediately were pulled into this response function, and we, after that initial case, our mayor and our governor and our public health authorities continued to make decisions and changes about the way government operated, about the way communities operated and interacted, and of course we were part of that. Like many other jurisdictions, we closed our buildings for any indoor activities, and particularly for our communities that were more susceptible to the disease early on, and really worked to keep our parks and open spaces accessible and available to everyone, including folks who are unhoused, and we have a significant population in Seattle of folks who are unhoused, and in many cases now are living in our parks. And we moved to different, what we called mission essential functions, in terms of how do we support all of the individuals, all of our residents, in both, again, keeping everybody safe and healthy, but also in ensuring that we could provide access to our parks and open spaces. And so a real key pivotal moment for us was the beginning of April, our Easter holiday weekend. We created, in response to the behaviors and the crowding that were happening in our parks, we created a new program that was designed to help us collect this data, and it was called the Social Distance Ambassador Program. Again, as Diana said and others have said, we know fundamentally that parks and open spaces are absolutely critical for our residents, and especially during the pandemic, this idea of places of refuge and the relaxation and exercise and mental respite were so critically important. But early on in the pandemic, as we were learning, trying to make decisions about what to do with our operations, and our mayor was very much engaged, and again, really did an incredible job getting us to keep our residents safe. And now, because of the actions that we took very early on under her direction, we're doing really well, relatively speaking. But I do recall some conversations we were having very early on about what do we do with parks, what do we do with the open spaces, and how do we keep people safe. And I remember a very specific conversation I had with the mayor about how we know what's happening in our parks, and we struggle with tracking outdoor use. We have people counters and things like that for our indoor facilities, but for outdoor use, it's tough. And I made the mistake of using the term, basically saying something you said, Diana, like anecdotally, we know what's happening in some of our parks, which was obviously a mistake. And very quickly, she pushed me and our team to figure out how we actually get some data to put together to make those decisions. So unfortunately, that first weekend in April that we started thinking about this, because we had really warm weather coming, we were really concerned about crowding as we continued to learn what was happening with the disease. We decided to close our large regional parks just for that weekend. And it was an incredibly difficult decision, again, knowing how important these parks were for our residents. But in concert with closing those parks, we created this new program, which we called our Social Distance Ambassador Program. And they had several key roles in sort of this action. And it wasn't, their role isn't to enforce park rules. So we wanted to have them there as a presence to remind people in the parks about what we expected in terms of behavior. There was a pretty robust public awareness campaign that was aligned with this about, the fact that if we crowd our parks, it's going to be difficult for us to keep them to keep them open. And they collected data. They were out there. We created, and I'll talk about this in a second, we created a smartphone app where they collected the data that then fed into a dashboard that then we could begin to make decisions that were much more data informed, and decisions about the use, the types of crowding or not that were happening, the types of behavior, and just numbers. And it really allowed us to make these decisions, obviously not anecdotally, but actually looking at some of the data. This is a brand new program. We had to stand it up. We stood it up literally over a few days in advance of this Easter weekend in 2020. And had to do lots and lots of training and help them understand their role. And of course, all of this, as we went through the summer, was also happening during the civil rights reckoning that was happening here in the United States, when there's lots of questions about enforcement and policing in our parks. And we wanted to be very careful and thoughtful not undermine our own access goals by over enforcing. So we had to do a lot of robust training. And these social distance ambassadors that were in our parks 7 days a week, from about noon, which is when the more popular youth starts, and then into the evening, 9 or 10 p.m. during these peak summer months. And of course, as the weather turned and got rainier, then we scaled that down and did fewer hours. But because this was a new program, we had about 65 people in our parks, but we were pulling from all of our different other divisions and training people who obviously this was a new position. So overall, we had about over 270 Parks and Recreation individuals, employees who stepped up and helped us implement this program through various shifts. And we continue that work, as I said, into the rainy season here in Seattle, as we again continue to make sure that we keep everybody active. And again, this was about getting data to make decisions, whether there were policy decisions about what to do with our overall programming in parks, and or some operational decisions about whether we close parks or parking lots, etc. As we did this, we stood up pretty quickly a data tool, and this is essentially a Microsoft form that was utilized on smartphones by these ambassadors who would go out and on a regular basis while they're roving around in these priority parks, engaging with community, reminding them about the physical distancing, reminding them about masking, but also collecting data in various sections of each of the parks that we're assigned to. And we were doing this on a regular cadence. Every hour, we expected them to come in and give us this report so that we can begin to build this data. And in addition to that, they gave us information whenever they had to intervene with problematic behavior, whether it was people who weren't complying about the social distancing, and then later not complying about mask wearing or large gatherings, and again, not to enforce, but at least to remind folks, and then at the same time help us collect that data. And then that form, leads into a dashboard that we used regularly to make the decisions that I mentioned. This gives, after several days of collecting data, and of course now over a year into this, we've got very robust trend data. And of course, this isn't completely, these are snapshots, so this gives us trends. But as you can see by the dashboard here, it gave us trends about peak usage, for example, where then we could do things like modify our maintenance schedules. It gives us information about parks that were having problematic behavior in terms of crowding. We could go in and understand whether these was physical challenges with the park or others. And then also looked at to the bottom right here, you see sort of comparing acreage of parks with usage of parks. So we have some parks that are relatively small, the one, I don't know if you can see this big column in the middle, with lots and lots of use. So that obviously gave us the impetus to try to make some changes and some additional modifications there. And so it was really, again, gave us this robust data. In addition to the quantitative data, we also collected some qualitative data that we then used in regular convenings with our operations and policy staff to decide what we can do. And of course, this was all very dynamic because we were all learning as we were going through the pandemic. So if we saw parking issues in certain parks, we then could collaborate with our parking enforcement partners in the city to help off-leash area use and things like that. So really helped give us some robust information to make those decisions. On the public awareness side of things, we also shared all of this information with our council, with our community members, so that they too can help us with that responsibility. And we created things like what you see on the screen here, which is more sort of more easily digestible dashboard. You can quickly see the sections that show red knows there's problematic behavior, and we could tell the parks that had more orange and more red, we knew that there were some significant interventions that we needed to make. The ones that were green, this allowed us to make decisions, for example, about taking our ambassadors that were assigned to those parks, moving them over to other parks, again, to be responsive to the dynamic and quickly changing situation. And of course, all of this, Martin made this point as well, all of this helped us convince folks and make the case for resources. And so because of the data we collected, because of the benefits of the program, we were able to make the case and utilize some federal dollars, recovery dollars, to fund this program, which obviously was really helpful in the time when our budgets were pretty significantly reduced. As we emerged from the spring and summer of 2020, and then continued to work on building on the ambassador program, and this program obviously highlighted, particularly for the outdoors, the importance of ensuring that these decisions were data informed. And of course, this is part of our continuing performance and improvement for the department. But this was a great case study, a great example. And so now, as we move to reopen parks, as the pandemic wanes in our community and folks are getting vaccinated, et cetera, we're pivoting a little bit in how we use this data. And so we still have the need to have eyes on our parks, so to speak, to continue to provide information, but that need is somewhat different. So we've evolved this ambassador app into a park cleanliness app, for example. And so we have, I mentioned at the beginning, we have a significant number of unhoused individuals who are residing in our parks that we need to keep track of, and particularly around health and safety and cleanliness. So we have all of our team members who are out in the field can collect this data, whether they're ambassadors, whether they're maintenance staff, and now whether there are recreation programmers who are out in the field. They can also gather this data, and all this data again feeds into this dashboard, so we continue to get more robust data. And of course, we're learning that now, as the sun is shining here in Seattle again, many folks are coming outdoors, especially after being locked up for over 15 months. There's additional challenges that we have, and we're also learning, for example, when we map this out, if there are parks that have specific maintenance needs that we weren't aware of, or because of the cycling, etc. And it's just another way for us to be responsive and reactive in a positive way to the needs of our communities. Another key aspect of our work, of course, has been ensuring that as we're making these decisions, that we're not undermining our focus on access and our focus on equity. And this has always been a key consideration as we've gone through this program. So again, during the pandemic, during the civil rights reckoning, during the disparate impacts that the pandemic and the reckoning have had on communities of color, we wanted to make sure that as we were implementing this program, that we were still highlighting and underscoring it with equity in mind. And so I talked about the training that our SDAs received in terms of how to interact with our community members, making sure that as we were making decisions and looking at the data, that these were not disparately and negatively affecting other communities. And so we continued to train. We continued to make sure that we weren't having unintended consequences through our operations here. And then, of course, we learned a lot during this process. We learned a lot about the data collection. Now, again, we've got a nice, robust set of trend data that now we can compare this summer to last summer. We compared this spring to last spring. Obviously, we can begin to make those things actionable. We learned about what things we could do operationally and policy-wise to impact behavior for our visitors, whether it's messaging, which is really important and actually really useful for us, or specific operational changes into our parks. And now we're continuing to try to find ways to collect demographic data, for example. So when all the various staff members who are out and about collecting data, they can begin to collect demographic information to help us understand more specifically what's happening in our parks, and then this helps us make decisions about health and safety and security programs and the physical plant, etc. And then how we work more closely with our partners in agencies like the police or transportation, etc. And so it really has been an incredibly useful process that we've gone through that has given us some really useful tools that now we continue to evolve. And again, the key is to be able to make these decisions in a data-informed way. And with that, I'd like to go ahead and stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go through this conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jesus. I think it sounds like, the pandemic really sort of motivated Parks and Rec to start collecting more robust data. So it's great that you're now looking to expand that and you're looking for ways to incorporate it more into the ways that you operate. So that's wonderful. So let's move into audience Q&A. So we've had lots of questions coming in, and folks can continue to feel free to submit questions. So we've had several questions that are kind of within buckets. So I'm going to try to combine a couple of things. So one challenge with measuring park use is that it doesn't capture the needs or desires of people who aren't using the system, nor what people might wish were different about the way the system is operating. It's only looking at how they're using the system as it currently is. And someone else had kind of relatedly, specifically kind of talked about the unheard voices of, you know, seniors, diverse communities, folks maybe with physical challenges, that kind of thing. So how are you capturing that kind of information in order to have sort of a more complete picture of what the community wants? I know you've spoken to this a bit, especially Martin, in relation to the surveys, but just curious if you have any other thoughts to share on that. So let's start with you, Martin.
Yes, that is always a challenge. We are using two different methodologies. I guess the first way is through phone surveys. So having phone surveys, you also engage with people that do not necessarily use our parks. The other way is through focus groups. If you set up a focus group in the right way, you will get a broad spectrum of representation. And quite often, members in that focus groups are not people that typically use our parks. And then it's important through those focus group discussions to get a better understanding of what the barriers or obstacles are for people not using parks, and get some information on whether council could deliver specific services or facilities to get those people more interested in parks. So yeah, that is always a challenge, but at this point in time, phone surveys and focus groups seems to be working for us.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So kind of weaving together these different approaches. Jesus, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I think like Martin mentioned, we also do customer engagement surveys on a semi-annual basis to collect the data about use and interest, etc., which is really helpful and very powerful. And we do it via phone mostly, and we make sure that it's statistically significant, that make sure that we capture all of the various areas of the city. But in addition to that, I think the engagement that we do, either project specific when we're doing capital development programs or initiative specific, I think we're working through learning how to do that better. In 2019, we launched our agency-wide strategic planning process, which we were really focused on engaging with folks, not just the ones who know how to get to us and not just the ones who are in our facilities, but across the board, trying to get everybody there. And so one of the things, for example, we did was engage during the events, so that we would create these big events, have people come to that, and then sort of talk to them as they were coming through and engage about what they were interested in. We also did lots of social media surveying. We did lots of surveying in our community centers as people were walking in. But because we knew we were still not getting everybody, we actually hired what we called community engagement ambassadors, who went door to door with snapshot surveys in various different languages to talk to the residents who weren't using our facilities, obviously, because they're at home, to talk to them about what their interests, their needs, and their what they wanted to see us be able to do. And so I think as we continue to moving forward, those are the models that we're going to continue to build on, in addition to the more survey type things and things like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thanks. So we also have received a number of questions around, small or underfunded staffs. What kind of tips would you give folks that are kind of just starting out on this journey and starting to collect this info? So what I'm going to combine a couple questions here, but what are some of the single most valuable, easiest methods to begin developing? Which measurement is the most cost effective? And then there were some questions about cost of the systems, which I could ask in a second. But so I think that's really around, like, how do you even start doing this, and what is most cost effective for small agencies that are starting this process? Jesus, why don't we start with you on that?
Yeah, that's a great fundamental question about everything we do in Parks and Recreation. How do you make it happen? I think from a cost effectiveness standpoint, I think event-specific engagement, I think, is one way. If you're we have our mobile recreation teams who are already out there programming in our parks. Training them, giving them this relatively simple tool. It's a Microsoft Form tool that's easy to get to. and collecting that data and engaging. I think that's one way. I think citywide surveys are relatively cost effective because you're paying someone to go through and make these phone calls, and of course you're going to miss people doing that. I think from the perspective of standing up like the ambassador program, and again, I think for us the challenge was how do we measure what's happening outdoors, right? On the inside of buildings, we're much better. We got program registration data, we've got people counter data, but outside, in Seattle, we can't do the cameras like it sounds like Martin does and other things like that. So it had to be people focused, which is obviously expensive. So I think it's just figuring out where you can leverage. I think one of the things about Parks and Recreation staff is we're pretty flexible and where we can leverage the staff. So for example, we have our maintenance staff who's out in our parks every day doing their work, training them on using this relatively simple app to gather the data that they can go. So that doesn't cost you much more than training and making sure that folks feel comfortable doing it. So I think those are some of the ideas that I would begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leveraging what you have and trying to build on that and starting there. Martin, anything to add on that one?
Yes, I think observation surveys are probably the cheapest way, and you get a lot of qualitative data. It's amazing what you can learn through just doing some observation analysis. But my other suggestion is start small, because the different methodologies that I discussed are not necessarily applicable in all cases. So I suggest start with one park and trial a few different methodologies, and then see what works best for your community. And once you have identified the methodologies that suit your purposes, then roll that out to the wider parks network. And then over time, when possible, try to undertake at least 2 different types of surveys. For example, one qualitative data and one quantitative data one. Typically, we would undertake between 2 and 5 different surveys, and then by overlaying the data of that surveys, we can get a very holistic picture. Yeah, so that's basically some of the recommendations.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I think the other thing, and just in data use writ large, I think the other thing that is important for folks to recognize is most agencies are already collecting a lot of data, right? And it may not be specifically data to answer the question that you have at the time, but really looking at all of the data that you're collecting. So for example, we've got lots of data on maintenance and work orders. We've got lots of data on the way that our maintenance routes are. So you can begin to use some of that to try to answer some of these questions. So I think every single organization has lots of data collection tools already. You just need to sort of figure out what those are and then build on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So somebody asked, which was something that I was going to ask you folks, and Martin, you talked about this a little bit. You kind of went over having explored maybe using anonymized smartphone data or GPS on people's mobile phones. So somebody was asking about that cities are using that kind of technology and those types of apps to track activities and that kind of thing. So have you considered using those types of apps to get usage data? And yeah, like what were your considerations and why did you determine that wasn't the best fit for you? If you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yes, yeah, we definitely explored using Wi-Fi data and smartphone data, but at the time it could not give us the level of accuracy that we were looking for. For example, we were looking for we wanted to identify the tree that people go to. That was the level of accuracy, and at the time the Wi-Fi data could give us information on a wider catchment, and that catchment was bigger than the park that we were surveying. So we to get more accurate Wi-Fi data, we had to install Wi-Fi towers in the park, but yeah, that was just too expensive. So that is why we then delivered the heat mapping process by putting different cameras in the park, and then we generate the maps through the video recordings. But again, it doesn't mean that we might not look at that again in the future. we are constantly looking for different innovative ways to collect data. So it may well be that in a different scenario, the Wi-Fi data will be more suitable.
Yep. So a couple of kind of specific questions. Somebody was asking, what web-based solution do you use for track counting? I think that is for you, Martin. So like kind of some of the specific, I think you might have mentioned one of the specific apps that you're using, but I don't know if you can speak to that question anymore. So web-based solutions that you're using for track counting.
Yeah, so I can get back to you on that. Now, I don't know exactly the system that we use, but it is an app that we use that that gives us live updates on the track counters. The other web-based system that I talked about was Social Pinpoint, and that is a software that you can buy, and it's quite flexible because you can adjust the type of information and feedback that you need. But yeah, I'm happy to send you more detailed information on the exact software that's used for the track counters.
That would be great, and we could include that in the follow-up email to registrants as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And so somebody asked, and I believe the answer to this is that you're using staff, but they were asking if you're using staff, or are you engaging consulting firms at all in this work? Jesus, are you entirely using staff, or are you engaging any consulting firms?
For the ambassador program, it's just our staff. Both for obviously for the deployment into the parks, but also the trainings. We do the data, the app development happened in-house as well. So all of this was done internally.
And Martin, same for you.
For us, we use a combination of staff and contractors. We have a relatively small team, so we don't have the capacity to undertake all the work. But I have operational budgets that we can use to engage contractors to undertake some of the survey work, especially the work that is quite time consuming.
And speaking of that, kind of staying on the staff question issue, I think you both went into some detail about how you sort of deploy and maybe train staff, but somebody was asking, you know, who does the counting and the observational studies? So maybe a little bit more about how you deploy staff, how you determine where they're going to be, what kind of staff capacity is needed, you know, on a given day or in a given week. I think you said you had a team of 8 for Martin, but maybe if you could expand on that a little bit. And I don't know if you have anything else after that, Jesus, that you want to add. I think you talked a bit about how you were deploying staff, but.
Yes, yeah, the 8 park specialist, the value that I add is by assessing the data and translating that into specific outcomes, and that then drives the level of investment that we need to deliver. So we would typically use contractors to undertake the surveys, and then use the staff to do the analytics at the end. In some cases, we would use graduates that have just joined council, and we use them to do the observation surveys. And that is a cost-effective way of doing that.
Yeah, I think just to add a little bit about our program, again, as I mentioned, ours, at least for the ambassador program, well, let me clarify. On the surveys that I talked about, customer engagement surveys that we do citywide, those we actually do use a consultant to conduct that for us. But specific to the ambassador program, because it was a new program, we basically leveraged the fact that all of our buildings were closed. We redeployed those staff members into the parks, trained them, and then they were the ones collecting the data. So on any given day in the peak season, we had about 65 people who were out and about. Of course, those were a bunch of different individuals, but 65 shifts, so to speak. As the weather, you know, gets rainier, then we have fewer people that do that. But those are the staff members that are actually also collecting the data, they're doing the interventions, they're educating, you know, and as this evolved, these staff were handing out masks, they were handing out information about testing initially, and then vaccines as we moved on. So they were also just a good, you know, ambassador functions that were being implemented in the parks.
Great. So someone asked, and I think let's start with you, Jesus, on this one. Any advice on how to establish an ambassador program that is welcoming and not imposing to visitors, you know, kind of feeling like Big Brother's watching sort of situation?
Yeah, I think that's a fundamental question, incredibly important, and we wrestled with that question quite a bit, because again, at the beginning, we were trying to mitigate specific behaviors, right? We were trying to keep people from crowding. Initially we were trying to keep people from just staying in our park. We wanted them to come in to enjoy it and walk and keep going. So we wanted to make sure that as we're training the individuals, I mean, you saw a picture there where you know, they're not uniformed. They have a vest, so we know that they're Parks and Recreation staff, but they're not like our rangers who are uniformed. Their job, is not to enforce, right? So if they witnessed, they were trained. If they witnessed behavior that needed additional support, they would then call our security office, who would then determine whether we call the police, or obviously they would call 911 if you know, the police emergency folks if they needed to. But it really came down to the training and really understanding, you know, again, we're here both to keep everybody safe, but again, to interact, to provide information, to encourage folks to comply, but not at all about enforcement. And I think that was really key for us.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that makes sense. Anything you want to add on that one, Martin?
Yes, no, just to agree. We also had rangers during the COVID lockdowns, but then they were the friendly face of council and focusing more on education rather than enforcing, and you know, similar to Jesús. And yeah, people were quite happy to engage with them, and any issues they would bring that back, and then we would address that in different ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we have lots of questions coming in. We have just a minute or so left, so I'm going to try to just grab a couple here. Is there anything that you find, or that your elected officials find to be most useful in terms of the data that's coming out of this, or reports, or anything like that? What do you find to be most impactful or useful to you?
Yeah, I think in my case, the fact that we can take an evidence-based approach, and that we are in a way giving the silent majority a voice. And I think elected members and our local board members like the fact that they can make decisions based on evidence. So to me, holistically, that is probably the most useful component, and that enable us to provide quality advice.
Mm-hmm. Jesus?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I would agree with that. I think when especially in a quickly changing environment, we found that our council really appreciated getting that data, so they could help us spread the message about, look, we're trying to keep the parks open, but we want to keep everybody safe. So they were able also to support our messaging because they had the data accessible to them as well.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, and especially as the resources available to all of us are diminishing, we have to be able to make the case, as Martin said. We have to be able to understand that we're making decisions based on this data, not just on what anecdotally we think is true.
Mm-hmm. Right, great. So we had a lot of questions that we couldn't get to, and there were some fairly specific ones about technology and different things. So I'll see if I can kind of pull these together and maybe circle back with you two, if you don't mind, just to possibly get some of these questions answered for some of these folks. So I will aim to do that. But in the interest of time, that was our last question. So I just want to thank our speakers for joining us today and sharing their journeys in data collection and how that work is evolving over time. Please visit the events tab at cityparksalliance.org for information about upcoming webinars. If you have additional questions, you can reach our speakers directly at the emails shown on the previous screen, and that the presentation will be sent to you afterwards as well. City Parks Alliance is hosting a virtual summer series this June 14th to the 25th, which will feature a diverse set of speakers and educational sessions focused on themes of racial equity, resilience, and recovery. We're going to have a great mayor's session where city leaders are going to be discussing parks as infrastructure, a grant makers panel on monuments where panelists will talk about ensuring that public art reflects an inclusive history and the diversity of their communities. Registration is open now, so please visit the website listed on the screen for all the latest information about speakers, sessions, and registration options. If you're interested in becoming a City Parks Alliance member, please visit cityparksalliance.org/join for information about all of our great member benefits and rates. And if you're interested in joining World Urban Parks and collaborating with colleagues across the globe, please visit their website, which is also in this slide presentation, to learn how you can get involved. Within 2 business days, you'll receive an email with links to today's recording, related resources, and instructions on how to claim your continuing education credits for AICP and World Parks Academy. And lastly, I just want to thank all of you, our attendees, for joining us today. Please take a minute to fill out the short evaluation that will pop up after the session concludes. Thanks again to our speakers, and keep up the great work that you're all doing for your communities and for the world's urban parks. Take care.